He had rehearsed those words for 6 months. 6 months of planning of letters, already written and sealed, while Anne Montgomery still believed she was building a life with him. 10 years. 10 years of holding Winthrop Hall together, knowing every tenant by name, managing every crisis before he noticed one existed. And Richard Winthrop spent those same 10 years looking straight at her and never once truly seeing her. If you have ever given everything to someone who treated you like furniture, this story is for you. Subscribe and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? We read everyone. The fire in the library had burned low by the time Richard Winthrop came home. Anne Montgomery noticed that first. Not her husband's footsteps on the marble floor. Not the lateness of the hour. Not even the particular silence he carried into the room, the kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. She noticed the fire. Because she had built it herself that evening, as she always did when the November chill crept through the stone walls of Winthrop Hall, and it should have lasted another 2 hours. Which meant she had been sitting in that library longer than she realized, waiting without knowing she was waiting, working through the estate ledgers with the careful attention she brought to everything in this house. Everything except herself. The accounts were spread across the mahogany desk. Tenant tallies, harvest yields, winter supply orders for 12 families who depended on the Winthrop land. Anne had a gift for numbers. More than that, she had a gift for understanding what numbers meant to the people behind them. When old Tom Hartley's column came up short 3 seasons running, she didn't dock his wages. She visited his property, saw the drainage problem eating his eastern field, and arranged repairs before winter made it worse. When the Miller family's payment arrived late, she knew before anyone told her that Mrs. Miller had been ill. Richard never asked how she knew these things. He never asked much about the estate at all. She heard him before she saw him that particular creak on the 4th stair, the one she'd asked the carpenter to fix twice, and Richard had dismissed twice as unnecessary. A woman learns the sounds of her own house. A woman learns the sounds of her husband. And something in the way his footsteps crossed the upper hall told her tonight was not an ordinary night. He appeared in the doorway. Anne looked up. "You're late." "I know." Richard Winthrop was a handsome man 41 years old with the kind of jawline that still turned heads in Philadelphia drawing rooms, and the kind of eyes that had once made Anne Montgomery, then Anne Caldwell, youngest daughter of a respected Virginia family, believe she had found a man worth building a life beside. "I was held up in the city." Dinner was kept warm for 2 hours. Cook was concerned. "I'll apologize to her in the morning." Anne set down her pen. There it was. That particular arrangement of ordinary words that somehow said nothing at all. She had learned to read the spaces between Richard's sentences, the way she read the estate ledgers, looking for what was missing, for what the columns refused to explain. "Sit down, Richard." He didn't sit. He moved toward the fireplace instead, positioning himself with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, studying the low flames with an attention they didn't deserve. Anne watched him. She had watched this man for 10 years. She knew every gesture, every hesitation, every way he organized himself before a difficult conversation. He was organizing himself now. "There's something I need to tell you." Her hands stilled on the ledger page. "Then tell me." Richard turned. And in the moment before he spoke, Anne saw something she had never quite seen in his face before. For not guilt, exactly, and not grief. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a man who has already decided something and is only now discovering that deciding and doing are 2 entirely different weights to carry. "I have met someone." The library went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have learned to share silence. A different quiet. The kind that arrives when a room understands something has broken inside it. Anne did not move. "Who?" "Her name is Victoria Ashcombe." Anne knew the name. Of course she did. Victoria Ashcombe was the kind of woman whose name traveled ahead of her into every room. A widow of 28, London-born, possessed of the sort of beauty that made men forget their own sentences. She had come to Philadelphia the previous spring guest of the Harrington family, and had spent the summer collecting invitations and admirers with equal ease. Anne had met her once briefly at the Harrington summer ball. She remembered thinking that woman is very good at being watched. She had not thought anything else about it. She was thinking a great deal now. How long? Richard's jaw tightened. 6 months. 6 months. Anne sat with that number, the way you sit with something that doesn't quite fit the shape of what you thought was true. She counted backward in her mind. 6 months meant June. June meant the Harrington ball. June meant the night she had stood beside her husband in the garden, and he had said the fireflies were extraordinary this year, and she had agreed, and she had felt in that particular moment that they were perhaps closer than they had been in some time. June. She almost said it aloud. Instead she asked, "Do you love her?" Richard didn't answer immediately. That silence said more than any word he could have chosen. Anne looked down at her hands. They were folded on the ledger, neat, steady, unremarkable. The hands of a woman who managed an estate-organized winter stores, kept 12 families fed through hard seasons. Hands that had smoothed Richard's coat, before every important meeting held his arm through every society function, written every letter of thanks that kept the Winthrop name respected in 3 counties. She had not noticed until this moment how tired they were. "I see." Anne. "No." The word came out gently. Not a wall, not a weapon. Simply a boundary drawn quietly in the air between them. "Let me finish." Richard stopped. "I am not going to shout at you." She lifted her eyes to his. "I am not going to weep or accuse, or make this into the kind of scene that gives the servants something to discuss for a year. That is not who I am, and I think you know it." "I know. What I want to know." Anne continued, her voice as level as if she were discussing the winter accounts, "is when you stopped deciding to choose me." Richard blinked. That was not the question he had prepared for. "Anne, it isn't. Because I have been here." She rose from the desk slowly, with the particular dignity of a woman who has made a decision of her own. "I have been here through the harvest failures and the debt with the Caldwell Bank and the winter your mother was ill and the year the Eastfield flooded. I have been here managing this estate, keeping this family holding the name you inherited with more care than you sometimes understood it needed. I know you have. Do you, not angry, just wondering, genuinely wondering? Because a man who knows that does not spend 6 months with another woman, while his wife believes they are building toward something." Richard had the grace to look away. "You expected anger," Anne said quietly. "Perhaps tears. Perhaps a confrontation that would make this easier to frame, give you a villain, give yourself a reason." He said nothing. "I am not angry, Richard." A pause. Long enough for truth to settle. "I am disappointed." Those words did something to him that anger never would have. Because anger was familiar. Anger was something you weathered, something you could wait out. Disappointment from Anne Montgomery was a different matter entirely. It had the specific weight of something irrevocable, like a judgment delivered not in passion, but in perfect clarity. "I thought you were a better man than this choice suggests." He flinched. "I thought—" She stopped. Looked at the room around her. The bookshelves she had arranged. The Persian rug she had selected after 6 months of correspondence with a merchant in Baltimore. The painting above the mantel that had been her wedding gift to him. A landscape of the Virginia hills where she'd grown up, chosen because she thought a man should have something beautiful to look at in his own library. "I thought we were partners." "We are." "No. Quiet. Final. Partners see each other." The fire crackled. Richard reached for her arm. "I never wanted to hurt you." Anne looked at his hand on her sleeve, then looked at his face. "I know." She removed her arm gently without drama. "That is almost the saddest part." She walked to the door. "The estate accounts for November are on the desk. The Hartley drainage repairs are scheduled for the 15th. I'd recommend you don't postpone them again. The eastern field will flood by February if the work isn't done. Cook has a cold. She'll need 3 days rest. The winter orders for the Miller and Connolly families should go out by Friday." Richard stared at her. "Anne." She paused at the door. "Where will you go?" She considered the question. "Somewhere I can remember who I was before I spent 10 years making myself smaller, so you wouldn't feel overshadowed." And then she was gone. Richard Winthrop stood alone in the library for a very long time. He had expected many things from this conversation. He had rehearsed her responses, anticipated her objections, prepared gentle deflections for the accusations he had assumed she would make. He had been, if he was honest with himself, almost relieved to have the secret out, that particular relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has finally set it down. He had not expected to feel worse after setting it down. He poured himself a glass of brandy and stood at the window. Outside, Winthrop Hall's winter grounds were silver and still under a half-moon. He could see the kitchen garden bare now, the dormant roses in their beds. He could see the path to the tenant cottages. He had not known about the Hartley drainage problem. He had not known Anne had arranged repairs. He stood at that window and counted slowly all the things he did not know his wife had done. It took longer than he expected. The next morning, Anne was gone before breakfast. She had not made a scene of her departure. No dramatic exodus, no tearful farewells to the household staff. She had spent the previous evening quietly in her private sitting room, and by first light, she was in the carriage with 2 trunks, her mother's jewelry box, and a stack of books tied with leather cord. Mrs. Chambers, who had been the Winthrop housekeeper for 20 years, stood at the front entrance and watched the carriage go. She didn't speak, but she pressed her lips together in a way that Richard, had he been watching, might have recognized as the expression of a woman who understood exactly what had just happened and would not forgive it for some considerable time. Richard was not watching. He was in the city at Victoria Ashcombe's townhouse, telling her that everything was settled. Victoria Ashcombe received this news with the precise expression of a woman who has won something she wanted and is wise enough not to celebrate too openly. She was genuinely beautiful. Anne had not been wrong about that. Dark-haired, pale-skinned, with the kind of effortless elegance that came from having been told since childhood that rooms changed when she entered them. She wore her beauty the way some women wore diamonds, not as ornament, but as armor. She took it well. Victoria settled onto her silk chaise, arranging her skirt. Anne always takes things well. Richard poured wine. She was never the sort of woman who made scenes. No. Victoria accepted the glass. I imagine not. Something in her tone was almost thoughtful. Richard didn't notice. I was already imagining the season ahead. Dinners, evenings at the theater. The particular pleasure of having someone on his arm who made other men look twice. Victoria was everything the Philadelphia social world valued. Beautiful, fashionable, charming, in the precise way that made hostesses compete for her attendance. Anne had never been those things. Anne had been something harder to name. He would not think of that now. I've arranged for you to meet the Harrington family for dinner Thursday, Richard announced. And the Ashworth ball is the following week. They've been asking about you. Victoria smiled. How lovely. At the Winthrop Hall estate, in Richard's absence, something quiet began to happen. The servants talked. Not loudly, not carelessly. The Winthrop staff were professionals trained to discretion. But in the kitchen after supper, in the stable yard at dawn, in the laundry rooms where voices could be covered by the sound of water and work, they talked. About Mrs. Winthrop. About the morning she'd risen at 4 to oversee the harvest when Richard was in the city and the head overseer had fallen ill. About the Christmas she'd arranged gifts for every child on the estate out of her own household account, anonymously, because she didn't want anyone to feel it was charity. About the afternoon she'd sat with old Mrs. Hartley for 3 hours when the woman's husband had a bad turn. Not because it was expected, not because it was documented anywhere in the ledgers of duty, but because she had looked at a frightened woman and thought someone should be here. James Whitmore, the estate's head groom, said nothing for 3 full days after Anne's departure. On the 4th morning he found a letter on his work table. It was from Mrs. Winthrop. It contained careful instructions for the care of the 2 horses she had personally trained, a note asking that he give her particular thanks to old Fletcher, who had taught her to ride when she first came to Winthrop Hall as a young wife, and a small sum of money, her own designated for the purchase of proper winter feed when the estate stores ran low. She had known the stores would run low. She had planned for it before she left. James Whitmore read that letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket where it stayed for the remainder of the winter. He did not speak of it. But there were mornings when Richard Winthrop came to the stables and found the groom looking at him with an expression that was not quite contempt. James was too professional for contempt, but was perhaps the very close neighbor of it. 3 weeks after Anne's departure, Richard attended his first major social event with Victoria on his arm, the Ashworth Winter Ball. It was everything he had anticipated. Victoria moved through rooms like a tide easy, inevitable drawing everything toward her. She knew how to work a gathering the right compliment for this hostess, the precise laugh for that gentleman, the subtle art of being both approachable and slightly unattainable that kept every conversation slightly charged. She was magnificent at it. Richard watched her genuinely admiring. And then somewhere around the second hour, something unexpected happened. He found himself at the edge of a conversation, a discussion between two older gentlemen about a water rights dispute affecting 3 estates in Chester County. A complicated matter involving county records historical deed language and an easement from 1793 that had been ambiguously worded. Richard knew the broad strokes. He didn't know the details. He found himself thinking Anne would know. Anne had spent 3 months navigating a similar dispute on behalf of 2 of their tenant families the previous year. She had corresponded with a Philadelphia attorney, researched the original land grants, and ultimately resolved the conflict through a combination of historical documentation and personally negotiated compromise that had saved both families significant legal costs. He had known she was handling it. He had not known how. He had not asked. He stood at the edge of that Chester County conversation and felt for the first time the specific shape of what he had dismissed. Not Anne the wife. Not Anne the society hostess. Anne the person who could have contributed something real to that conversation, who probably knew more about 1793 easement language than anyone else in the room. He went to find Victoria. She was at the center of a laughing group, brilliant and luminous and entirely at ease. He smiled at her, but the feeling didn't go away. In the weeks that followed, Richard threw himself into the pleasures of his new life with the particular energy of a man trying not to hear something. There were dinners. There were theater evenings. There were morning rides through Fairmount Park and afternoon calls, and the kind of continuous social buoyancy that Victoria navigated so naturally it seemed effortless. It was effortless. That was he would come to understand the problem. Anne had never been effortless. Anne had been present, interested, specific. When she talked to you, she was actually talking to you, not performing attention, not calculating the social yield of the conversation, but genuinely curious about what you were saying and why. She remembered things. She followed up. She asked the second question, the one that went past the easy answer into the real one. Richard had over 10 years grown so accustomed to this quality that he had stopped recognizing it as a quality at all. He recognized it now. He recognized it at a dinner party in December when an elderly gentleman named Professor Aldrich mentioned in passing a problem he was having with a historical text, a translation question that was blocking his research, and Victoria offered a bright, sympathetic smile and moved the conversation smoothly toward more comfortable ground. Anne, Richard thought, would have had 3 ideas and 2 questions before the soup course ended. He did not say this aloud, but he thought it. December brought the first real winter cold to Winthrop Hall, and with it, the first real evidence of what Anne's absence meant. It was not dramatic. It was not a single failure. It was 100 small things arriving one by one, each one individually manageable and collectively overwhelming. The Hartley drainage repair had not been scheduled. James Whitmore, who had been following Anne's instructions for years and had not understood until now quite how many instructions he had been following, discovered this when he went to arrange the work and found no contractor had been contacted, no materials ordered, no account designated. He brought this to Richard's attention. Richard arranged it. But the delay had cost 2 weeks and the weather was closing in. The winter orders for the Miller family had gone out late because Richard had not known they needed to go out, and nobody had thought to tell him because everyone had assumed he knew, because Mrs. Winthrop had always known. The order was short by 3 items. Mrs. Miller sent a polite note. Richard's secretary handled it. But there was a tone in the note, not accusatory, not unkind, that Richard read 3 times. The tone of a woman who has always been treated with consideration and has noticed with quiet bewilderment that something has changed. Mrs. Chambers presented the household accounts at the end of the first month, and Richard sat with them for an hour, genuinely baffled by several entries that Anne had apparently carried in her head, arrangements and designations and informal understandings that had never needed to be written down, because Anne had always been there to carry them. Who authorized this quarterly payment to the Connolly family? He pointed to a line item. Mrs. Winthrop, sir. Mrs. Chambers' voice was perfectly neutral. She arranged it 3 years ago. The Connolly boy, the eldest, has a condition that requires a specific medicine from the Philadelphia apothecary. Mrs. Winthrop established the arrangement quietly so the family would not feel the charity of it. Richard stared at the entry. She never mentioned it. No, sir. A pause. She rarely mentioned the things she did for people. She seemed to feel it was simply what one does. Richard closed the account book. Keep the arrangement. Yes, sir. He sat alone in the library after Mrs. Chambers left. The fire was burning well. Someone on the staff had attended to it, as someone always attended to things that Anne had once attended to. Except now it required organizing and instruction and the particular effort of management, rather than the invisible continuity of a woman who simply saw what was needed. He poured brandy and looked at the painting above the mantel, Virginia Hills. He had never thought to ask her why she'd chosen that particular painting. He thought about it now. His daughter arrived from Boston in mid-December. Eleanor Winthrop was 22, recently married, living in Boston with her young husband and their infant son. She had been born in the 3rd year of her parents' marriage, had grown up at Winthrop Hall, and had her mother's eyes the same particular shade of gray, clear and careful and missing nothing. She did not bring her husband. She arrived alone, unannounced, on a Thursday morning. Richard met her in the entrance hall. Eleanor, father. She removed her gloves, looked at him with those gray eyes. We need to speak. They went to the library. Richard ordered tea. Eleanor sat, folded her hands, and said, I received a letter from Mother. Is she well? She is. A pause. She is in fact better than she has been in some years. She seems lighter, which is a remarkable thing for a woman whose husband of 10 years just announced he preferred someone else. Eleanor, I am not here to argue with you. Her voice was composed. She had her mother's composure, the particular kind that was not coldness, but was instead a very deep quiet, like still water over a strong current. I am here because I want to understand something. What? Eleanor considered him for a long moment. Did you know, she said, that when I was 14, I nearly failed my mathematics examinations. I was terrified. I didn't tell you because you were traveling with business matters in the city. I told Mother. I didn't know that. No. She picked up her teacup. She spent 6 evenings with me at the desk in her sitting room, working through every problem set until I understood it well enough, not just to pass the examination, but to actually understand why the mathematics worked. She never mentioned it afterward, never used it to demonstrate her patience or her effort. It simply happened and was over, and I went on. Richard was quiet. When I was 18, and Thomas Ashworth told everyone at the Harrington Ball that I had humiliated him by refusing his offer, Eleanor continued, and I came home in tears because the story had gotten turned around, and people were saying it was I who had behaved badly. Do you know what Mother did? No. She wrote 6 letters, personally, to 6 women she trusted in Philadelphia society, carefully chosen, each one known for her discretion and her influence. She laid out the truth of the situation with such clarity and such kindness toward Thomas Ashworth, framing it as a simple misunderstanding, rather than his dishonesty, that within a fortnight the story had corrected itself. My reputation was restored, and not one person knew she had arranged it. I didn't know any of this. I know you didn't. Eleanor set down her teacup. That is what I am trying to help you understand, Father. You didn't know. You didn't know because she never asked you to notice, and you never thought to look. The fire crackled. She was not invisible because she was unimportant. Eleanor looked at him steadily. She was invisible because you had decided somewhere along the way that invisible meant manageable, that quiet meant content, that a woman who didn't demand your attention didn't need it. Richard felt those words find places in him they didn't improve. "You did not lose Mother because she left," Eleanor said quietly. "You lost her because you stopped seeing her." She stood. "I'm going to visit the estate for a few days. See to some of the arrangements she left in place." She picked up her gloves. "I thought you should know I'm here." She walked to the door. "Eleanor." She stopped. "Is she?" Richard started. Stopped. Started again. "Is she happy?" Eleanor looked at him over her shoulder. "She's becoming happy," she said. "Which is somehow worse, isn't it?" And then she too left the room. Richard sat alone in the library, where his wife had spent 10 years of evenings keeping an estate and a family and a marriage running on the strength of her own invisible industry. Outside the November grounds of Winthrop Hall lay silver under the winter sky. The fire burned steadily. Someone on the staff had built it well. He didn't know who. He had never thought to know. And in the growing quiet of that room, surrounded by the evidence of everything Anne Montgomery had built and kept, and quietly sustained the arranged books, the managed accounts, the carefully chosen painting of Virginia hills. Richard Winthrop sat with the particular loneliness of a man who has traded away something irreplaceable for something beautiful, and is only now beginning to understand the difference. Richard Winthrop did not sleep well that December. He told himself it was the cold. The old stone walls of Winthrop Hall had never kept heat the way the city townhouses did, and without Anne's particular habit of ordering extra wood stacked near the upstairs rooms before the first hard freeze, the upper corridors ran chill in a way that woke him at odd hours. He told himself that was the reason. He was not a man who examined his own excuses carefully. Eleanor stayed 4 days. In those 4 days, she moved through the estate with a quiet efficiency that reminded every member of the staff of someone they missed considerably. She met with Mrs. Chambers about the household schedule. She sat with James Whitmore in the stables for an entire morning, going over the horse care arrangements Anne had left in her letter. She reviewed the tenant accounts, cross-referenced them against Anne's winter supply orders, and identified 2 additional shortfalls that neither Richard nor his secretary had noticed. On her last morning, she came to breakfast and placed a folded paper beside Richard's coffee. "What is this?" "A list." Eleanor buttered her bread without looking up. "Of the things Mother was managing that no one has taken over. I've arranged temporary solutions for the most urgent items, but someone needs to make permanent decisions about the rest." Richard unfolded the paper. It was long, much longer than he had expected. He read through it slowly. Some items he recognized: the quarterly legal reviews of tenant agreements, the seasonal orders for estate supplies. But others stopped him entirely. An informal arrangement Anne had maintained with a Philadelphia physician to visit the estate's elderly tenants twice yearly at reduced rate, billed quietly to a household account designated only as medical. A correspondence she had kept up with the local minister about 3 families whose circumstances required careful and private support. A running record of every significant event in every tenant family: births, deaths, marriages, illnesses, that she had tracked not for administrative purposes, but because, as Eleanor explained when she saw him staring at that particular item, she believed that a landowner who didn't know the names of the people on her land had no business owning it. She kept this in her head. Richard looked up. She kept some of it in a leather journal. Eleanor finally met his eyes. She took the journal with her. Richard set the paper down. Of course she did. Eleanor watched him. "Father?" "I know. Do you?" Not unkind, just direct in that particular way she'd inherited. "Because I want to make sure you understand something before I go back to Boston. Mother is not at the countryside property recovering from a wound. She is not sitting in a quiet room waiting for you to come to your senses." Richard looked at her. "She is working." Eleanor folded her napkin. She arrived at Caldwell House, and within a fortnight she had assessed the property's needs, met with the local tenants, and begun organizing a systematic repair of the estate's finances, which had been neglected for several years since grandfather's death. The property manager, a man named Briggs, who has held that position for 20 years and is not especially accustomed to being directed by women, wrote to our cousin James to complain that Mrs. Winthrop was overstepping her authority. Richard blinked. What did James say? James told Briggs that Mrs. Winthrop had more financial intelligence in one correspondence than most estate managers demonstrated in a full year, and that Briggs would do well to cooperate. Eleanor permitted herself a small smile. James always had good sense. She's managing the Caldwell estate. She's transforming it. Eleanor stood. She has a purpose, Father. She has work that is entirely her own land, that responds to her decisions. People who appreciate her competence, without needing her to make herself invisible first. She picked up her gloves. I am glad for her. A pause. And I think if you sit quietly long enough with that list, you will begin to understand why. She kissed his cheek, collected her traveling case from Mrs. Chambers, and was gone by 8 o'clock, her carriage disappearing down the Winthrop Hall Drive in the thin winter light. Richard sat at the breakfast table alone. He looked at the list for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket, where it stayed for the remainder of the winter. The new year arrived, the way New Years always do at estate houses, with a round of social obligations that required appearing well-rested and optimistic, regardless of what the previous year had deposited in one's conscience. Victoria Ashcombe hosted a dinner in the second week of January, and Richard attended as he always attended her events now, with the particular attention of a man who has staked something significant on a choice and needs it to be worth the cost. The dinner was excellent. Victoria's cook was talented. Her table settings were impeccable. Her guest list was well curated, 3 couples from the best Philadelphia families, a visiting English baronet and his wife, a prominent attorney named Foster, who moved in circles, Richard was quietly glad to access. The conversation was bright and well managed, moving from topic to topic with the ease of a gathering that had been carefully arranged to avoid difficulty. Richard sat at Victoria's right hand and watched her work the table. She was genuinely gifted at it. The baronet's wife, a somewhat stiff woman named Lady Cranworth, who had a reputation for finding American society lacking. Victoria had at ease within 20 minutes, drawing her out on the subject of her London garden with such specific and intelligent questions that Lady Cranworth was clearly startled and then clearly pleased. The attorney Foster, who tended toward the ponderous, she managed with the precise balance of attention and gentle redirection that kept him from dominating the conversation without making him aware she was steering him. She was in every measurable social sense extraordinary. Richard watched this and felt admiration. And then the attorney Foster mentioned in passing that he had recently handled a complicated estate matter for the Caldwell family, the Virginia branch through their Pennsylvania holdings, and the table expressed the polite interest of people who are too well bred to ask for details but not entirely uninterested in them. Richard went very still. The Caldwell property at Chester Ridge. Richard kept his voice even. The same. Foster accepted more wine. Though I should say it required rather less of my intervention than I'd anticipated. The new manager there, Mrs. Winthrop, I believe she is formerly of this very county, had already identified the key legal questions before I arrived. Quite remarkable, actually. She had the deed history sorted back 3 generations and a proposed resolution that held up to scrutiny far better than these things usually do. Silence. Not the whole table, just Richard's end of it. The baronet said, "Winthrop any relation?" Foster glanced at Richard. A fraction of a second's hesitation. A professional man's hesitation, the kind that comes from knowing something and deciding how much of it to say in present company. A distant connection, I believe. She sounds capable, Lady Cranworth observed. Exceptionally so. Foster was warming to the subject now, apparently deciding that capability was a safe topic in any company. What struck me was not simply the legal intelligence, but the, I don't quite know how to say this without sounding patronizing, which I assure you, I don't intend the human intelligence of the approach. She had already met with every affected tenant personally. She knew their situations, their concerns, their histories, with the property going back 10 and 15 years. When I suggested certain solutions that would have been legally clean, but would have displaced 2 families from their long-held arrangements, she simply said, He paused, half smiling at the memory. She said, "Mr. Foster, a legal solution that costs people their security is not in the final accounting a very good solution." Lady Cranworth looked approving. "She was right," the attorney added. "We found a better approach." Richard picked up his wine glass. His hand was perfectly steady. Inside him, something was not. Victoria across the table caught his eye. Her expression was precise and unreadable. She changed the subject beautifully. On the drive home, they sat in the carriage together in a particular kind of quiet that was different from their usual comfortable silence. Victoria spoke first. "You were unsettled at dinner." "I was fine." "Richard." Her voice was not unkind. It was simply exact. Victoria Ashcombe did not deal in comfortable fictions, which was one of the things he had genuinely admired about her. "You went quiet the moment Foster mentioned your wife." "My situation with Anne is—" "It is what it is," Victoria said. "I'm not asking about the situation. I'm observing that hearing of her apparent success unsettled you." Richard was quiet. "It should not surprise you," Victoria continued. "You told me yourself she was capable." "I told you she was good at managing the estate." "Yes." A pause. "You described it, I recall, as a talent for organization." "She is organized." Victoria looked at him. "Richard." Quiet. Deliberate. "The woman your attorney described tonight was not organizing linen cupboards. She was reading deed histories, navigating legal questions, and managing human relationships across an entire estate, simultaneously, and producing results that impressed a man not easily impressed." He didn't answer. "I think," Victoria said, looking toward the carriage window, "that perhaps you described her the way you thought of her, which may not have been the way she actually was." The carriage rolled on through the dark January streets. "You are not angry," Richard observed. "Why would I be angry?" "I don't know. Most women would be." Victoria turned to look at him with an expression that contained something almost like pity. "I knew who I was entering into an arrangement with," she said. "A man who had grown tired of something valuable and mistaken that tiredness for something else. I did not deceive myself about that. And now?" She considered this. "Now I wonder," she said carefully, "whether what you were tired of was Anne, or whether you were tired of not being seen by her quite clearly enough." The carriage stopped at her door. She gathered her wrap. "Good night, Richard." He sat in the carriage for a long time after she went inside. At Caldwell House, 2 counties away. Anne Montgomery Winthrop was not thinking about Richard. This was not an act of discipline. It was not a decision she had made and enforced against the resistance of her own feelings. It was simply what happened when a woman who had spent 10 years organizing herself around another person's needs was suddenly faced with the extraordinary circumstance of organizing herself around her own. The property at Caldwell House had been neglected. Not devastatingly, not irreparably, but in the specific way of estates that had lost their careful hand, where nothing is visibly broken and everything is gradually eroding. The fences were sound, but the drainage needed work. The tenant contracts had not been reviewed in 6 years. The household accounts were honest but inefficient, with money going toward comfortable habits rather than necessary improvements. Briggs, the property manager, who had written to Cousin James with his objections, had taken one look at the quietly dressed woman who arrived in November and made a swift assessment. A noblewoman of the temporarily displaced variety, here to recover her composure, unlikely to involve herself seriously in the actual operations of the property. He had been comprehensively wrong. Within her first week, Anne had asked him for every document he maintained on the property. Leases, accounts, repair records, correspondence with suppliers, weather records, crop yields going back 8 years. Briggs had provided them with the air of a man, humoring an unexpected request, and had been genuinely startled when she returned them 3 days later with a 12-page analysis of patterns and priorities. Mrs. Winthrop. Briggs stood in the estate office doorway, holding her analysis, clearly uncertain how to receive it. "This is thorough. The drainage on the north field is the most urgent matter," Anne said without looking up from the ledger she was currently reviewing. "It's been a problem for at least 4 years based on the yield records. The contractor listed in your 1815 correspondence did the work on a neighboring property last spring. His rates are reasonable, and his work appears to hold. I'd like you to contact him this week. The ground is frozen, I know. But if he's engaged now, he'll be ready to start the moment the ground breaks in March. If we wait until spring to have this conversation, we'll lose the early season window. She looked up. The Miller family in the North Cottage, their lease arrangement has not been reviewed since 1813. Given what the yield data shows about that section of the property, it's not a fair arrangement for them. I'd like to revisit it. Briggs stared at her. That lease was established by your grandfather. My grandfather established it in different conditions. Anne met his eyes not unkindly, but without any particular willingness to be redirected. The conditions have changed. The arrangement should reflect that. A pause. You're not what I expected, Briggs said. No. Anne returned to the ledger. I rarely am. By February, the Caldwell estate had a functioning plan for the spring, a revised contract with the Miller family that resulted in Mrs. Miller crying quietly over the new terms and pressing Anne's hands with both of hers, and a correspondence established with the attorney Foster that would resolve the long-standing deed question efficiently and equitably. Briggs, who by this point had entirely reversed his initial assessment, told his wife at supper one evening that in 20 years of property management, he had encountered precisely 3 people who understood land and people in equal measure simultaneously, and that Mrs. Winthrop was one of them. His wife, who had met Anne at a local church gathering and spent 2 hours in her company, said, "Only 3. What Briggs could not have known, and what would have surprised him had he known it, was that Anne herself was surprised. Not by her competence. She had always known quietly that she was capable. But there had always been a frame around that knowledge. The frame of being Richard Winthrop's wife, of operating within the defined space of his estate, his name, his world. Her capability had always been in some fundamental way in service of something that was not hers. This was hers. The realization arrived not all at once, but in small accumulations. The first time she made a decision about the property without consulting anyone, and felt not uncertainty, but clarity. The first time a tenant came to her with a problem, and she solved it, and the gratitude was directed at her. Not at the estate, not at the Winthrop name, but at Anne Montgomery, who had understood their situation and acted on it. The first time she sat at the estate desk in the early morning with the ledgers spread before her, and felt not the dutiful weight of responsibility, but the genuine pleasure of work that was entirely unmistakably her own. She wrote to Eleanor in February, not about Richard, not about the situation in Philadelphia, about the Northfield drainage project and the Miller family lease, and a young woman named Clara from the village who had come to ask about the possibility of working in the Caldwell house, and who Anne had discovered in conversation had a gift for household accounts that was going entirely unrecognized. Eleanor wrote back, "You sound like yourself. I didn't realize I'd missed that until now." Anne read the letter twice. Then she folded it and went back to work. The person who noticed the change in Richard Winthrop before anyone else was Mrs. Chambers. Housekeepers notice everything. It was their professional requirement and their peculiar burden to see the household clearly enough to manage it without seeing it so clearly that the seeing became unbearable. Mrs. Chambers had maintained this balance for 20 years at Winthrop Hall, through seasons of prosperity and seasons of difficulty through the early years, when Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop were young, and finding their footing through the middle years, when the estate had grown and the responsibilities had multiplied, and Mrs. Winthrop had gradually quietly taken on more and more of the weight. She had always known what the ledgers could not show. She had never said so. Now she watched Richard Winthrop move through his own house with the particular disorientation of a man who has reorganized his life around a central absence, and is only gradually understanding how central that absence was. He gave instructions that contradicted each other. He asked questions about things that had always been managed without his involvement, and when answers required context, he didn't have his frustration was directed at the wrong targets. In March, he called her into the library. "Mrs. Chambers, the spring tenant reviews." "Yes, sir?" "When were they typically conducted?" A pause. Mrs. Winthrop began them in late February, the housekeeper said carefully. She preferred to have the reviews complete before the spring planting decisions needed to be made so that any adjustments to arrangements could be factored in from the beginning of the season. Who conducted them with her? She conducted them herself, sir, with the estate overseer for the farming matters and alone for the personal and family circumstances. Richard looked at her. Alone. The tenants spoke more freely one-to-one. Mrs. Chambers kept her voice neutral. Mrs. Winthrop felt that a formal review with multiple estate representatives present made people say what they thought was expected rather than what was true. She wanted to know what was true. Richard was quiet for a moment. She never told me she did them alone. No, sir. Did she tell you? She told me things when she needed my assistance, Mrs. Chambers said. She managed a great deal that required no assistance from anyone. Richard stood at the window. Is that a criticism, Mrs. Chambers? The housekeeper considered this with the care of a woman who has 20 years of professional discretion and a very precise moral sense operating simultaneously. No, sir, she said finally. It is an observation. She turned to go. Mrs. Chambers. She stopped. What did she tell you when she left? Did she say anything to you directly? A silence. She thanked me, Mrs. Chambers said, for 20 years of good work. She was very specific about particular things she said I had done well. She had clearly been thinking about it. A pause. She also said that she hoped the household would continue to function as it had. That was the phrase. Continue to function as it had. She said it as though she was not quite certain it would. The housekeeper left. Richard stood at the window alone. Continue to function as it had. He had assumed somewhere in the back of his mind that it would. That the estate was a machine that ran because it was a machine, not because a specific person had spent 10 years maintaining it with invisible hands. He understood now. It was not a machine. It had been a garden. And Anne had been the gardener. April arrived, and with it the slow return of warmth to the Winthrop Hall grounds. Richard rode the property on a Tuesday morning and saw it with new eyes, or rather old eyes, asking new questions. He stopped his horse at the east field, where the drainage repairs were now finally complete, 3 weeks later than Anne's instructions had specified, the delay having cost exactly what she would have predicted it would cost. He stopped at the Hartley cottage and spoke with old Tom Hartley, who was cautiously optimistic about the spring planting, but who spoke without quite meaning to, about Mrs. Winthrop twice in the course of a 10-minute conversation, about how she'd known about the drainage, about how she'd come to sit with his wife. She was a good woman, Tom Hartley said, then caught himself. Is a good woman. Richard nodded. He rode on. At the edge of the property, where the Winthrop land met the old boundary road, he stopped and looked back at the hall. He had grown up here. He had brought Anne here as a young wife, full of the comfortable assumption that the house would continue as houses do, sustained by the invisible labor of capable people who did not require acknowledgement, because that was simply what capable people were for. He had thought of Anne as part of the house, not its architect, not its heart, its furnishing. The thought arrived with a clarity that was physical, something in his chest that wasn't quite pain, but was adjacent to it. He sat on his horse at the edge of his property and held that thought the way you hold something that has burned you carefully at a slight distance, understanding that the heat is information. He had made her invisible, not intentionally, not cruelly, but with the particular thoughtlessness of a man who has confused consistency with invisibility, who has mistaken the absence of complaint for the presence of contentment, who has looked at a woman building something extraordinary and seen only that the building was getting done. He turned his horse back toward the hall. There was work to do, but the work felt for the first time like atonement rather than administration. In Philadelphia, Victoria Ashcombe was making her own assessments. She was not a woman who deceived herself. She had understood from the beginning that what existed between herself and Richard Winthrop was based on a particular kind of mutual advantage. His need for brightness after what he experienced as a gray decade. Her need for position and companionship in a city that had received her well, but not yet fully. She had been clear-eyed about this. She had not pretended it was something it was not. But clarity of mind did not prevent all forms of discomfort. She had watched Richard these past months with the careful attention of a woman who knows she is watching a man struggle with something that has nothing to do with her and everything to do with what he left behind. She had seen the way he went quiet at unexpected moments, the way his eyes sometimes moved to the middle distance during a conversation, returning only when he noticed he had left, the way he sometimes began to say something and then stopped himself rerouting. She knew what he was stopping himself from saying. She had met Anne Montgomery Winthrop once, briefly, at the Harrington summer ball the previous year. They had not spoken more than 3 sentences. But Victoria had watched her across the room for 10 minutes with the professional attention of a woman who had spent her adult life assessing people quickly and had thought that woman is doing 17 things at once, and nobody in this room knows it. She had thought nothing else about it then. She was thinking considerably more now. In April, she received a letter from a friend in Chester County, a woman named Augusta Penfield, who moved in the circles that intersected with the Caldwell estate's social world. Augusta wrote with her usual cheerful excess of detail, covering 3 pages of local news before arriving at the item Victoria suspected, with her particular instinct for emphasis, she had been building toward all along. You will perhaps have heard something of Richard Winthrop's wife, the former Mrs. Winthrop, I suppose one says now, who has taken up residence at Caldwell House, Augusta wrote. I have met her twice now at the Reverend's gatherings, and I must tell you she is quite something. Not in the way of the fashionable women one meets in Philadelphia, not that kind of something. The other kind. The kind that walks into a room and you find yourself wanting to tell her your honest opinion of things, because you suspect she would actually hear it. Her tenants speak of her in a way I have not heard tenants speak of an estate owner in 30 years of paying attention to such things. And she has, I'm told, turned the Caldwell property around in 4 months, in a way that Briggs, who is no fool, says will take 3 years to fully appreciate. I only mention it because I recall you knowing the family. Victoria folded the letter. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she did something she rarely did, which was permit herself a few minutes of complete honesty. She was clever. She was beautiful. She was accomplished in the arts of social navigation and conversation, and the management of impressions that mattered enormously in the world they all inhabited. These were genuine gifts, and she had worked hard to develop them. But she had never sat with a frightened woman through a long night. She had never learned a tenant family's circumstances by heart. She had never looked at a man struggling and thought, what does he actually need, rather than what would please him to receive. She had not been built for those things. She had been built for rooms. Anne Montgomery had been built for people. Victoria rose from her chair, walked to her writing desk, and began composing a letter that she had been thinking about for several weeks, and had been honest enough with herself to know she would eventually have to write. It was addressed to Richard Winthrop. It was not a long letter, but it said in the precise and careful language of a woman who prided herself on clarity that she had been doing some thinking. That she found she could respect what she had come to understand about the situation, more than she could continue in a direction that was on reflection, not being fair to anyone, least of all herself. She signed it. She sealed it. She sent it before she could reconsider. Then she sat in her sitting room in the early April light, and felt with the particular clean sensation of a conscience that has done something right, a great deal better than she had in some considerable time. The letter arrived at Winthrop Hall on a Thursday morning. Richard read it in the library. He read it twice. Then he sat for a long time looking at the painting above the mantel, the Virginia hills, gentle and green, chosen by a young wife who had thought her husband should have something beautiful to look at in his own home. He had never asked her why. He knew now, because Anne Montgomery had understood even at the beginning, even before she had any particular reason to doubt that the life they were building would hold. She had understood that beauty was something you give to people who matter to you. Not because they ask, not because they notice, simply because they matter, and that is reason enough. He had been in that library 1,000 times. He had never really seen the painting. He folded Victoria's letter carefully. He placed it in the desk drawer. He sat in the gathering afternoon quiet of a house that was maintained by capable people, but sustained by no one. And he began slowly to understand the full weight of what he had thrown away. And it was heavier than he had imagined, much heavier, Because the worst part was not that Anne was gone. The worst part was that she was building something real and entirely her own, while he sat in the house she had kept alive and felt for the first time in his adult life the specific cold of being truly alone in a place that should have been home. The fire burned. Someone had built it. He still didn't know who. Victoria's letter sat in the desk drawer for 3 days before Richard told anyone. He didn't tell anyone. That was the truth of it. There was no one to tell. That realization arrived on the 4th morning with the particular clarity of things you already know, but have been carefully not looking at. He had organized his life for the past 6 months almost entirely around Victoria's social world. Her dinners, her gatherings, her friends who had become his companions by proximity. And now that world had closed quietly and without drama, and he was standing in his own library, understanding that the life he had dismantled had not been replaced by anything that could hold his weight. He sent no response to Victoria. She had not asked for one. She was too intelligent for that. He rode out to the East Field instead, because a man with too much to think about and nowhere useful to direct it will sometimes find that physical motion provides the thinking room that stillness cannot. The spring planting was underway. The drainage repairs finally complete had already demonstrated their value. The field that had flooded 3 of the last 5 years was holding. Tom Hartley was out with his eldest son turning soil, and he looked up when Richard rode past and touched his hat with the respectful wariness of a man who has been grateful to someone who is no longer present. "Morning, Mr. Winthrop." "Tom." Richard pulled up. "Field looks good." "It does." A pause. "The repairs held through the March thaw. Didn't lose a row." "Good." Another pause, the kind that fills itself with everything neither man is saying. "Mrs. Winthrop picked the right contractor," Tom Hartley said finally. Not accusatory. Just stating a fact the way farmers state facts about weather or soil because accuracy matters more than comfort. Richard looked at the field. She usually did. He rode on before the conversation could go anywhere that would require him to keep his expression steady. The spring social season arrived in Philadelphia with its usual insistence, and Richard Winthrop moved through it with the practiced ease of a man who has spent 40 years learning how to be in rooms full of people without actually being reached by any of them. He attended dinners. He attended a lecture at the Philosophical Society. He accepted an invitation to a card evening at the Harrington House, which he regretted almost immediately upon arrival, because the Harrington House was where he had met Victoria, and also where on the same June evening he had told Anne the fireflies were extraordinary and felt briefly that they were close. He played cards badly and left early. At home, he found himself doing something he had not done in years, which was simply sitting in the library after supper without purpose. No correspondence to review, no accounts waiting, no social engagement to prepare for. Just the room, the fire, the particular weight of a quiet evening in a house that had once been full of a woman's invisible industry and was now only quiet. He pulled out Eleanor's list, the one she had left at breakfast in December. He had read it perhaps 40 times by now. He knew every item on it. He had addressed in a practical sense, most of them arranged coverage, established new procedures, hired an additional household administrator to manage the things Anne had managed from memory. The estate was functioning. But functioning was not the same as what it had been. I understood that now, with a precision that no amount of competent administration could obscure. The estate had been under Anne's management something more than functional. It had been, he searched for the word, and landed on it with some surprise. It had been kind. That was the word. The Winthrop estate under Anne's stewardship had been managed with a kindness that was structural, not ornamental. It wasn't that she did kind things. It was that her understanding of the property and its people was organized around their humanity as its first principle. He did not know how to replicate that. He wasn't sure it could be replicated. He suspected it could only be embodied. He folded the list, put it back in his pocket, sat with the fire. In May, his son arrived. Thomas Winthrop was 24, working as an attorney in New York, and had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, or rather, his mother's way of using eyes, which was somewhat different from simply having them. He arrived unannounced, as Eleanor had arrived, and with the same directness that suggested he had been thinking about this visit for some time, and had decided to act before he could deliberate himself out of it. They took supper together in the small dining room. The conversation covered New York Thomas's legal practice, a matter of city planning that was consuming considerable civic attention. Thomas ate with appetite, and spoke with ease, and was in every observable way relaxed. Richard was not deceived. "You're going to say something," Richard said between courses. "Am I?" "You have your mother's face when you're organizing your thoughts." Thomas set down his fork. "I visited her," he said. "Last month. Caldwell House." Richard was very still. "How is she?" "I already told you I visited her," Thomas said. "Which means you know I'll tell you how she is and you're bracing for it. So let's both save some time." He picked up his wine. "She is well. She is better than well. The estate is genuinely impressive. What she's done in 6 months is the kind of thing that takes most managers 3 years. The tenants talk about her the way people talk about someone who has changed their lives without making them feel the debt of it. Briggs, who I understand had some initial objections, now refers to her as the best employer he's ever worked under, which, coming from Briggs, is approximately equivalent to a lesser man composing a sonnet." Richard looked at his plate. "I'm glad she's well." "Are you?" "Not unkind." Thomas had his mother's way with directness. He didn't use it as a weapon, just as the most efficient route between 2 points. "Or are you glad in the way we're glad about things we find difficult to actually feel glad about?" "Thomas." "Father." A pause. "I'm not here to make you feel worse than you already feel. I think you feel bad enough. I can see it. You look like a man who has figured something out that he would have preferred not to figure out." Richard looked at his son. "I made a mistake," he said. The words cost him something. Thomas heard what they cost. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "You did." "I am aware of the dimensions of it, more clearly than I was." "Good." Thomas refilled his own glass. "Because I want to tell you something that I think you need to hear, and I need to know you're actually ready to hear it rather than to manage it." A pause. "Tell me." "I was angry at you." Thomas said it directly without particular heat. "For several months. Not the sharp kind of angry, the slow kind. The kind that makes you go quiet at family dinners and have conversations in your head that you don't say aloud. I was angry because I watched my mother spend my entire childhood being extraordinary in ways that were entirely invisible, and I watched you not see it, and then I watched you." He stopped, collected himself. "Leave." Richard said nothing. "And then I went to Caldwell House," Thomas continued, "and I sat with her for 4 days, and I watched her. And something happened that I did not expect." "What?" Thomas looked at his father. "She wasn't angry." He seemed still somewhat struck by this. "Not at you, not at Victoria, not at the situation. She had I don't know how to describe it, a settledness. Like someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally set it down, and the surprise of not carrying it is still new enough to feel like a gift." Richard felt those words in a place that was not comfortable. "She's not waiting for you to come back," Thomas said. "I want you to understand that clearly. Not because she is closed to the idea. I don't know what she's closed to. But because she has found something that is genuinely hers, and she is not going to set it aside for the hope of something that might not materialize." "I understand." "Do you?" Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Because there's something else. There is a man." The room went quiet. "Who?" "His name is James Caldwell, a cousin distant from the Maryland branch. He came to Caldwell House on an estate matter in March and has come back twice since." Thomas watched his father carefully. "He is a good man. Quiet. Intelligent. He looks at Mother the way—" Another stop. "The way someone looks at a person they find genuinely interesting. Not the person they're supposed to find interesting. Not the person who fits a particular expectation. The actual person." Richard picked up his wine glass. Put it down without drinking. "She's not— they're not— No." Thomas was clear. "Nothing has happened. But something could. And Mother, When I mentioned him, there was something in her face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Not excitement exactly, more like permission. Like she had finally given herself permission to be seen. The supper continued. They talked of other things, but Thomas's words sat in the room with them for the remainder of the evening, and when his son finally went upstairs, Richard remained alone at the table for a very long time, and the fire burned down, and no one thought to build it back up, and the cold came in through the old stone walls, the way it always did, and he sat in it. The first week of June, Richard Winthrop rode to Caldwell House. He had not announced his visit. He had considered writing ahead, had composed 3 different letters, and burned each one, and had ultimately decided that a letter was the coward's approach, that it gave Anne the opportunity to prepare a formal reception, to manage the encounter before it happened, to receive him on terms that she had arranged in advance. He did not deserve arranged terms. He deserved to arrive at the door of a house he had no claim to, and wait to see whether he would be received. He waited 20 minutes in the entrance hall. The housekeeper, a local woman named Mrs. Pratt, efficient and unsentimental, had received him with neither warmth nor coldness, simply with the professional neutrality of a woman who has been given no instructions about this particular visitor and is making cautious decisions accordingly. She had asked him to wait. He had waited. He heard Anne before he saw her. Her voice from somewhere in the back of the house asking someone a question about the Northern lease records. Practical, specific, focused. The voice of a woman in the middle of work she cared about. Then footsteps, and she was in the doorway of the hall. Richard had expected he wasn't sure what he had expected. The Anne he had left. The Anne he had known. The woman who managed his estate with quiet competence, and managed herself with quiet dignity, and had always been in some part of his mind, simply there, a given, a constant something reliable in the way that walls are reliable. The woman in the doorway was not that Anne. She was the same woman. The same gray eyes, the same composed bearing, the same particular quality of attention that he had stopped noticing years ago and was noticing now with the full force of everything he had spent months understanding. But she stood differently. She occupied the space of that doorway differently, not more aggressively, not with any performance of changed authority. Simply as though the space were hers. As though she had stopped organizing herself around the possibility of being in the way. Richard. Not a question. Not particularly warm, but not cold either. Accurate. The way she said everything. Anne. He stood. I should have written. Yes. She moved into the room. Did not sit. You should have. I wasn't sure a letter was adequate. It would have been more courteous. She looked at him steadily. But you're here now. What do you need? The question landed cleanly. What do you need? Not what do you want? Not what are you hoping for? What do you need? Because Anne Montgomery had always understood the difference, and she was apparently not going to pretend otherwise on his behalf. I needed to see you. He paused. I needed to say things that are long past due. A silence. Anne looked at him with the expression of a woman who is deciding something and whose decisions tend to be sound. Sit down, Richard. They sat in the estate's small parlor across a low table with tea that Mrs. Pratt brought with the air of a woman who has decided to be professionally uninvolved and personally very attentive. Richard looked at Anne. Anne waited. I don't know where to begin, he said. Begin where it's true. He took a breath. I took you for granted. The words came out less smoothly than he had rehearsed them, which was perhaps why they sounded more honest. For years, I looked at everything you built and managed and sustained, and I categorized it as belonging to the estate, as belonging to the function of the house. I did not understand that it came from you, that it was you, your intelligence, your care, the specific way you thought about people. Anne was quiet. I didn't ask about the things you did, he continued. I didn't ask because I didn't think to ask, not because I was cruel, because I had made an assumption that what was working was simply working and did not require my understanding of how. Yes, Anne said, simply. That assumption was wrong. Yes, she said again. I don't know how to make it right. He looked at her directly. I don't know if it can be made right, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did. Not just Victoria. That part is not the worst part. Something shifted slightly in Anne's expression. What is the worst part? The worst part, Richard said, is the years before Victoria. The years when you were building something extraordinary, and I was looking at it and seeing furniture. Infrastructure. The correct functioning of things that should function correctly. He paused. I made you invisible, not intentionally, but consistently, and you deserved to be seen. Anne was very still. For a moment, something crossed her face that was not the composed steadiness she had maintained since he walked in. Something older. Something that remembered being 30 years old and capable and quiet in a house that had not noticed. Then it passed. I appreciate you saying that, she said. Her voice was steady, but not flat. I needed to hear it. I didn't know I needed to hear it until just now, but I did. I'm sorry, Anne. She looked at him. I know. A breath. I believe that you are. Is there... He stopped himself. Reorganized. I am not here to ask you to come back. I want to be clear about that. I don't have the right to ask, and even if I did, you have built something here that you deserve to keep. I can see it in this room. I can hear it in how your people speak in the hallway. Anne's chin lifted slightly. Then why did you come? Because I needed to apologize to your face. He held her gaze. Because a letter felt like something I was doing for myself, to ease my own conscience. And you are not owed a man easing his conscience. You are owed the actual thing. The silence between them was different from the silence in the Winthrop Hall library all those months ago. That silence had been the end of something. This one was harder to name. There is a question I want to ask you, Anne said carefully, and I want you to answer it honestly, not kindly. All right. Did you love her? Richard did not answer immediately. Anne waited. I thought I did, he said at last. I think I loved what she represented. The feeling of being chosen by something brilliant and visible. Of being with someone whose value the world could easily measure. He paused. Anne, you were never easy to measure. You required understanding, and I had grown lazy. Anne absorbed this. That is honest, she said. You asked for honest. I did. She looked down at her hands in her lap. The same hands he had failed to notice for years. Richard. What Victoria had, the social grace, the brightness, the particular way she made rooms feel, those things are real. I don't have them. I never did. No. I was never the woman who made every head turn when she entered a room. No, he said again. And then more quietly. You were the woman who made sure everyone in the room had what they needed before you thought about yourself. Those are not the same thing. I confused impressive with valuable. It was a profound mistake. Something in Anne's expression, and she would not have wanted him to see, this would have controlled it if she'd known it was coming, cracked open just slightly. Just enough. The way a window cracks open in spring and lets through one clean line of air. She looked away, composed herself, looked back. I have been working very hard, she said. Not to let what happened define what I believe about myself. Not to allow your choice to become an argument inside my own head about my worth. Have you succeeded? Some days more than others. A pause. The most honest thing she'd said. The work has helped. Having something that is entirely mine has helped more than I knew it would. Thomas told me. She looked up. He came in May, Richard said. He told me what you've built here. I should not have needed my son to tell me. I should have known I did know in the abstract. But hearing it from him with the specific details with his... He stopped. He admires you very much. I know. Something warmed in her face. He always did. I never entirely understood why. Because you were paying attention. Richard looked at her. You were always paying attention to the people who needed it. He noticed. Children notice. Anne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There is a man. The words were direct, deliberate. She was watching him as she said them. Richard held her gaze. Thomas mentioned it. Of course he did. A breath. James Caldwell. He is a good man. He is... She paused, choosing words carefully. He sees me clearly. He asks questions about the work. Real questions, not polite ones. He doesn't seem to require me to be smaller in order for him to feel adequate. Those words landed precisely where they were aimed. I want you to know I'm not telling you this to cause pain, Anne continued. I'm telling you because you came here for honesty and you deserve it, and because I need you to understand something. Tell me. I am not the woman who was waiting, she said quietly. I was for a long time. I think I waited without knowing I was waiting, kept myself in a particular readiness, a particular orientation toward the possibility of being seen by you. That was not a healthy way to live. It was a way of choosing every day to be peripheral to my own life. Richard felt those words deeply. I am not waiting anymore, Anne continued. Not for your return, not for your recognition, not for anything. I am living. For the first time in a very long time, I am living in the center of my own life, and it is... She stopped. A breath. It is extraordinary. I did not know it would feel like this. I'm glad, Richard said, and he meant it. Which was perhaps the most surprising thing about the entire afternoon, that he could sit across from this woman in the house she had reclaimed for herself and feel something that was not self-serving. Something that was genuinely glad. That the care she had spent on an estate that barely noticed had found its right home at last. He was also underneath that gladness in considerable pain. Both things were true. He did not hide either. They walked together through the estate grounds before he left an hour's walk covering the northern fields where the drainage project was underway. The tenant cottages where Anne stopped twice to exchange words with families who greeted her with the easy warmth of people who have learned they can rely on someone. Richard watched these exchanges. The way old Mrs. Miller reached for Anne's hand when she passed. The way a boy of perhaps 8 came running across a yard to show Anne something a bird's nest he had found, and Anne crouched down at the precise level of an 8-year-old boy and looked at the nest with the full attention of a woman who genuinely finds birds' nests interesting. How's Mrs. Miller? Richard asked as they moved on. Better. Anne straightened. She had a difficult winter. The new lease arrangement has helped considerably less financial pressure, more security. She's been sleeping. I kept the Connolly arrangement, Richard said. The medicine account. Anne glanced at him. Mrs. Chambers told me you'd asked about it. I kept every arrangement I could find, he said. Some I didn't find until they came up on their own. There were more than I knew. Yes. How many people were you quietly keeping? Anne looked at him. I wasn't keeping them, she said. I was paying attention. He felt those words like a correction. Because they were. He had framed it as keeping a transactional word, a word about management. She had framed it as attention, a human word. That distinction was, he understood now, the precise shape of what he had never understood about her. They came back to the house as the afternoon light was shifting toward evening. Anne stopped at the door. You should go before dark. Yes. He looked at her. She looked back, clear, steady, without the particular softness of a woman hoping to be asked to change her mind. Will you? He stopped. May I write to you, not with any expectation, simply to continue the conversation, because I find that I am only now beginning to understand who you are, and I don't want to stop. Something crossed Anne's face. Complicated. The expression of a woman who is deciding something real, weighing costs that only she can calculate. You may write, she said finally. I won't promise to answer every letter, but you may write. Thank you. He meant that too. He put on his hat. Anne, she paused. I am sorry, he said. Not for Victoria, not for the decision that brought us here. I am sorry for the 10 years before that. For every evening I sat in that library and let you hold everything together and thought nothing. For the years when you were extraordinary and I was busy elsewhere. Anne looked at him for a long time. I know you are, she said softly. That's the strange thing. I believe you completely. A pause. I just don't know yet what to do with it. She went inside. Richard stood at the door of Caldwell House in the late afternoon light and heard the sound of the house resume around her, the housekeeper's voice from somewhere, the distant sound of an estate in purposeful motion, and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that he was standing outside the life of a woman who no longer needed anything from him, which was exactly what he had created. He had wanted her to be manageable. He had made her self-sufficient instead. He rode home through the long spring evening, and the light was extraordinary. The kind of late afternoon gold that makes the Virginia countryside look like something from a painting, and he thought of a painting above a library mantel, and a woman who had chosen it because she believed a man should have something beautiful to look at in his own home. He had looked at it 1,000 times. He had never seen it. The road was long. He had a great deal of it to think in, and somewhere between Caldwell House and Winthrop Hall, between the life he had chosen and the life he had discarded, Richard Winthrop began the slow and unglamorous work of becoming a man who deserved the understanding he was asking for. Not because it would win anything back, not because it would reverse anything that had been done, but because Anne Montgomery had spent 10 years becoming extraordinary in his shadow, and the least he could do was spend whatever remained of his own time becoming worthy of having known her. Even if that was all he ever got, it would have to be enough. The stars came out before he reached Winthrop Hall. He didn't notice them. He was thinking about a bird's nest, and a woman who had crouched down in the dirt of a spring afternoon to look at it with the fullness of her attention, and how he had never once thought to look at what she was looking at. Richard's first letter to Anne was 4 pages long. He burned it. The second was 2 pages. He burned that one too, not because it was dishonest, but because it was still performing honesty, rather than simply being it. There was a version of himself in those pages that was arranged for an audience of one, and Anne had always been able to tell the difference between a man presenting himself and a man actually present. The third letter was half a page. He sent that one. It said only that he had thought about the bird's nest since he left Caldwell House, and that he understood now this was not a small thing, and that he was trying to learn what it meant that he had looked at the same woman for 10 years, and never once wondered what she was looking at. He did not sign it with any expectation. He sealed it and sent it, and spent the following week in the particular restless suspension of a man who has done something irreversible and must now simply wait for the world to respond. Anne answered in 5 days. Her letter was brief too, but not coldly brief, precisely brief in the way she did everything. She said that the bird's nest belonged to a boy named Samuel Miller, age 8, who had appointed himself the personal guardian of a pair of wrens nesting in the old fence post near the north cottage, and who gave her a daily report on their progress. She said that Samuel had never had anyone take his reports seriously before, and that taking them seriously had cost her approximately 6 minutes per day, and had returned in Samuel's general confidence and happiness, something she could not begin to calculate. Then she said, "That is what attention does. It is not expensive. It simply requires deciding that someone is worth it." Richard read that line 4 times. Then he wrote back. The letters continued through June. Not daily, not so frequently as to crowd the careful distance Anne had established, which Richard understood was not indifference, but self-protection, and which he respected with the precision of a man who has learned somewhat late that a woman's protective distance is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a boundary to be honored. He wrote twice a week. She answered when she chose to, which was not always, and not never. What surprised him was what the letters became. He had expected, perhaps hoped, that they would edge toward the personal, toward the question of what was possible between them. Instead, they stayed almost entirely in the realm of the practical and the observed. He wrote about the estate, about specific decisions he was facing, about problems he was navigating without the particular knowledge she had carried for so long. She answered with a frankness that was more useful than anything any of his advisers had offered, and he understood that this was her nature. She thought in solutions in the specifics of what a situation actually required rather than what it was supposed to require. In the 3rd week of June, he wrote about the Connolly boy. The arrangement Anne had maintained for the medicine, he had kept it as he'd promised, but he had not known until recently that the boy's condition had worsened over the winter, and that the current arrangement was no longer sufficient, and that the Connolly family, too proud to ask and too desperate to manage alone, had been quietly making impossible choices between the medicine and the food for 3 months. I didn't know what to do about it. He wrote to Anne because he had nowhere else to put the question where it would receive the quality of answer it deserved. Her response arrived in 4 days. It was 3 pages, the longest she had written. She laid out a specific revised arrangement with exact figures, cross-referenced against what she knew of the Connolly family's circumstances and dignity. And that word dignity appeared twice, both times in the context of how the arrangement should be structured so that the family received help without the particular shame of feeling like a charity case. She detailed which local physician was best suited to manage the boy's care going forward. She noted that young Patrick Connolly, now 14, had a facility with numbers that she had observed during her tenant reviews, and that it might be worth arranging for him to assist the estate bookkeeper on a paid basis, not as charity, but as genuine employment for a genuine skill. Give him work, she wrote. People of dignity can accept wages. They cannot accept pity. Richard read the letter standing at his desk. He implemented every recommendation within the week. When he told Patrick Connolly's father that the boy would be starting with the bookkeeper in July, Mr. Connolly stood in the estate office doorway for a moment, with the expression of a man trying very hard to hold himself together. And Richard felt something he had not felt in this estate in a very long time. Usefulness. Not management. Not administration. Usefulness, the kind that went somewhere real and reached someone who needed it. He wrote to Anne that evening and told her. Her response was a single line, "Now you are paying attention." He put that letter with the others in the desk drawer that had once held Victoria's farewell. July arrived, and with it a heat that settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, with the particular insistence of a season that has decided to make itself felt. At Caldwell House, Anne worked through it without complaint. She had always been practical about weather, the way she was practical about everything, which was to say, she understood it as a condition to be managed rather than an indignity to be endured. James Caldwell came the second week of July. He came ostensibly on an estate matter, a question about a shared boundary with a neighboring property that had some historical complexity and required Anne's review of the original Caldwell land grants. This was a legitimate matter. It also took approximately 90 minutes to resolve, and James stayed for 3 days. Anne was aware of what this meant. She was a woman of considerable intelligence, and she had been watching James Caldwell with the same careful attention she brought to everything, which meant she had noticed, among other things, the way he organized himself before conversations that mattered to him. She had noticed that he asked questions and then genuinely waited for the answers rather than assembling his response while she was still speaking. She had noticed that he remembered specific things she had said, not in the way of a man performing attentiveness, but in the way of someone for whom other people's thoughts had intrinsic interest. She had noticed, too, the way she felt when she heard his horse in the drive. Not anxious, not carefully composed against the possibility of disappointment. Simply glad. The simplicity of it was almost startling after years of relationships that required more complex internal weather. On the second evening, they sat on the Caldwell House terrace after supper, with the July darkness soft around them, and the sound of the estate settling into its nighttime self, and James said, "I've been trying to find a way to say something for approximately 3 months. Anne looked at him. 3 months is a long time to look for words. The words themselves aren't complicated. He turned his glass in his hands. What's complicated is the situation. Your situation. I have no wish to be a man who appears at the wrong moment and makes himself a distraction from what you're building. What if you're not a distraction? He looked at her. Then I would like to know that, he said carefully. When you're ready to know it yourself. Anne was quiet for a moment. I am not the same woman I was a year ago, she said. I want to be clear about that. I am not the woman who organized her entire life around someone else's noticing. I have learned some things about myself that I intend to keep. I wouldn't want you to unlearn them. What do you want? James considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. I want to know you, he said simply. The actual you. The one who reads deed histories at 6 in the morning and takes bird's nest reports from 8-year-old boys and argues with Briggs about drainage timelines. A pause. I've met the woman who walks into rooms and makes people want to tell her their honest opinions. I'd like to know her better, if she's willing. Anne looked at her hands. The same hands she had noticed in the Winthrop Hall library all those months ago were tired. They were not tired now. "I'm willing," she said quietly. James Caldwell did not reach for her hand, did not press the moment toward anything it wasn't ready to be. He simply nodded with the gravity of a man who understands that some things are best received without embellishment, and they sat together in the warm July dark, and it was enough. In Philadelphia, Richard Winthrop received a letter from his daughter Eleanor in the 3rd week of July. Eleanor's letters were always efficient. She had her mother's precision and her own particular economy of language, which meant she said what she meant without the social cushioning that most letters employed. This one opened without preamble. She wrote, "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about, and I want you to receive it as it's intended, which is not as an accusation, but as an observation from someone who loves you and also knows you well enough to tell you the truth." Richard put down his coffee. She continued, "You have been doing better. I can see it in your letters, the way you write about the estate, the decisions you're making, the specific attention you're paying to people you wouldn't have noticed a year ago." The Patrick Connolly matter was right. It was genuinely, unmistakably right. Not because it looked right, because it was. He exhaled. Then, "But I want you to prepare yourself for something. Mother, something is happening at Caldwell House. Not that you don't know this in some abstract way, but I think you need to know it specifically from someone who loves you both. James Caldwell is a good man. He is the kind of good that isn't performance, the kind that is simply how a person is organized. And Mother is not going to remain available indefinitely to the idea of a different outcome. She was invisible for 10 years. She is not willing to be invisible anymore. Not to herself, not to anyone. Richard read this standing at the window. "If you intend to do anything," Eleanor's letter continued, "do it because it is the right thing and you have actually earned the right to do it. Not because someone else is about to claim what you left behind. That would be the wrong reason. Mother deserves the right reason. I think you know what that is." He put the letter down. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in 20 years. I went to find Reverend Harmond. The Reverend was an old man patient in the way of people who have spent decades sitting with human difficulty and have stopped being surprised by any configuration of it. He received Richard in his small study without ceremony, offered him coffee and waited. "I need to speak with someone outside of the situation," Richard said. "That's often wise. I have made considerable errors." He looked at the Reverend. "I am aware of them. I've been trying to address them practically. The estate, the tenants, the arrangements Anne maintained that I hadn't known about. And I don't know if any of it is enough." He paused. "I don't know if any of it is the point." The Reverend looked at him carefully. "What do you think the point is?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "I think the point," he said slowly, "is that I spent 10 years with a woman I didn't actually know. And I am only now at 41 years old, having caused considerable damage, beginning to understand who she is. And what will you do with that understanding? I don't know." The honesty of it cost him something. "Part of me wants to go back, to ask for what I threw away. But Eleanor says I need to earn the right to ask. And I think she's correct. And I don't know if I have." The Reverend turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Let me ask you something," he said. "If Anne were to spend the rest of her life at Caldwell House building what she's building with a man who sees her clearly, and you were to spend the rest of your life at Winthrop Hall, managing your estate with genuine care, paying attention to the people who depend on you, becoming the man you perhaps should have been years ago, would that be enough?" Richard looked at him. "No," he said honestly, "but it would be better than I deserve." "That's a start." The Reverend set down his cup. "I'm going to tell you something, Richard. Not as a judgment, as an observation from someone who has watched a great many marriages and a great many endings." Richard waited. "The question is not whether you have changed, the Reverend said. Change is not particularly rare. People change when the cost of not changing becomes sufficiently high. The question is whether the change is in you or in your circumstances. I don't understand the distinction. Yes, you do. The old man looked at him steadily. Circumstances have changed. Victoria is gone. The estate showed you what was missing. Your children came and told you things that cost you. Those are all external. They happened to you. A pause. Has anything happened in you? The room was very quiet. Richard thought about Patrick Connolly, standing in the estate office doorway, trying to hold himself together. He thought about a letter that said, "Give him work. People of dignity can accept wages." He thought about sitting in the Winthrop Hall Library at midnight, reading a list. Eleanor had left understanding for the first time not just what Anne had done, but how she had thought the specific orientation of care that had made what she did possible. I think, he said carefully, that I have learned how to pay attention. To what? To what things actually cost. He looked at the Reverend. And to who is paying. The Reverend was quiet for a moment. Then go and do something useful with that, he said simply. Not as a strategy, not as a move in a larger plan, simply because it's what a man who is paying attention does. Richard nodded. He put down his coffee. He stood. Reverend? Yes. What would you have told me 2 years ago if I'd come here then? The old man smiled, not unkindly, but with the particular honesty of someone who has decided that kindness and truth should generally travel together. The same thing, he said, but you weren't ready to hear it then. Richard walked out into the July heat and stood for a moment on the church steps. The world was very loud around him. A busy street, horses, voices, the ordinary percussion of a city going about its business. He had walked through this city 1,000 times as Richard Winthrop of Winthrop Hall, a man of position and competence, and the particular confidence of someone who has never seriously doubted that the world is organized in a way that makes sense. He walked through it now as something smaller and more honest. A man who had been given extraordinary things and had not known how to see them. A man trying to learn. August. The summer had reached its fullest weight, and at Winthrop Hall, the harvest preparations were beginning. The coordinated effort of workers and planning and supply management that Richard now understood with full clarity. Anne had orchestrated every year with a precision that appeared effortless and was anything but. He was managing it himself this year. It was not effortless. Howe was in the fields at 6 most mornings and in the estate office until late, and in between, he was writing letters and making decisions and paying the kind of specific attention that he was discovering was not a talent, but a practice, something that required daily choice and daily recommitment that was never finished and never automatic. Thomas came in August and found his father muddy to the knee from a morning in the East Field and engaged in a detailed conversation with the head overseer about a section of the South crop that was showing signs of drought stress. Thomas stood in the estate yard and watched this conversation with the expression of a man who is seeing something he had not entirely expected. When the conversation ended, Richard noticed his son. Thomas. Father. A pause. You were in the field. Something's wrong with the South crop. Better to see it than hear about it. Thomas looked at him. You never went into the field before. No. Richard walked past him toward the house. I had someone to tell me what was happening. Thomas fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Thomas said carefully, I want to talk to you about something. I assumed. James Caldwell asked Cousin James for information about the Caldwell family's legal standing regarding the estate. Specifically the question of whether a remarriage would affect Anne's claim to the property she's been managing. Richard stopped walking. He's moving carefully, Thomas continued. He's not a man who rushes, but he's asking the questions that a man asks when he is serious. Richard stood in the August heat. A reasonable man would have expected this. He had been watching it approach in Anne's letters, not in what she said about James, which was little, but in what she didn't say, which was a great deal. Anne's silences had always been as informative as her words, and the particular quality of her silence on the subject of James Caldwell had been speaking clearly for 2 months. She deserves someone who will fight for her, Thomas said. That's all I'm going to say. I know. Do you? His son looked at him directly. Because there's a difference between knowing it and doing something about it. And the window is not going to stay open indefinitely. Richard resumed walking. I know, he said again. Thomas let it rest. That evening, Richard sat in the library for a long time. He looked at the painting. Virginia Hill's gentle and permanent, chosen by a young woman who had believed he deserved something beautiful in his own home. He had spent 41 years not understanding what he deserved. He picked up his pen. He began to write a letter. Not the careful twice-a-week letter of a man maintaining a correspondence. Not the practical letter of a man asking for guidance on estate matters. A different letter entirely. He wrote for 2 hours. He wrote about the East Field that morning. The specific feeling of standing in soil he owned and understanding. For the first time that ownership and stewardship were different obligations, and he had only practiced one of them. He wrote about Patrick Connolly, who had started with the bookkeeper, and who had in his 3rd week found an error in the quarterly accounts that had saved the estate $40, and who had brought this to Richard with the careful pride of a boy who has discovered that his mind is genuinely useful. He wrote about Tom Hartley's field, finally properly drained, yielding better than it had in 5 years. He wrote, "You taught me how to see these things. Not directly, not as instruction, but by doing them visibly and consistently for 10 years, in the hope that eventually I would look where you were looking." He wrote, "I looked away for 10 years. I am looking now." Then he wrote the thing he had been building toward for months, through every letter and every changed behavior and every new practice. I am not asking you to come back. I have no right to ask that. What I am asking is whether there is any version of the future in which a man who wasted 10 years of your extraordinary life could spend the years remaining in becoming someone worthy of knowing you. Not as your husband. Not with any claim on you or your choices. Simply as someone who has learned very late how to see you clearly. If the answer is no, I will understand it. You owe me nothing less than nothing. But I could not let this season pass without telling you what I have come to understand. He did not write "I love you," not because it wasn't true, but because he understood now that love without vision is only a feeling, and she had already received his feelings for 10 years without his vision. She deserved the vision. The rest could wait. He sealed the letter. He sent it in the morning. And then he did the thing that was hardest. He went back to work. Because a man who sends a letter like that and then sits idle is a man who is still doing things for his own comfort. A man who is actually changing sends the letter and then goes and does the work because the work is not contingent on the response. He was in the field by 7. The South crop was responding to the intervention. He made notes for the overseer and was back in the office by 9. Eleanor's voice appeared in his memory. Do it because you have earned the right to do it, not because someone else is about to claim what you left behind. He had not done it because of James Caldwell. He had done it because it was true. He would accept whatever came of that. Anne received the letter on a Thursday. She was in the middle of a meeting with Briggs about the autumn tenant reviews when Mrs. Pratt brought it in, and she recognized Richard's handwriting on the seal and set it aside without opening it, which caused Briggs to observe privately to his wife that evening that Mrs. Winthrop had the most extraordinary self-possession of any person he had ever worked with, because he would have opened that letter in approximately 4 seconds, and she had set it down as though it were tomorrow's weather report. She opened it after supper. She read it alone at the estate desk by lamplight with the sounds of the Caldwell House evening settling around her. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a long time. It was a good letter. She searched for the right word and landed on accurate. It was an accurate letter. The details he cited were real. The changes he described were not abstract commitments to being better, but specific accounts of specific actions. Patrick Connolly. Tom Hartley's field, the South crop, the mornings in the estate yard. He was not telling her who he intended to become. He was telling her who he was becoming, which was an entirely different thing and infinitely more valuable. She thought about James Caldwell, who would be coming next week. She thought about what it meant to be seen. She thought about Samuel Miller's bird's nest reports, and what it cost to give a child 6 minutes of real attention each morning, and what it returned. She thought about 10 years. She thought about the woman she was now sitting in her own house, running her own estate, with her own mind and her own choices, and the particular deep peace of a person who has found the center of their own life. She thought about what forgiveness was and what it wasn't. Forgiveness was not forgetting. Forgiveness was not the undoing of what had been done. Forgiveness was not the same as return. But it was also, she understood now, sitting in the lamplight of a summer evening, with a letter that had cost a man something real to write, not the same as permanent closure. People were not fixed things. She had changed. So had he. She could see it in the letter, not because he was telling her he'd changed, but because the quality of attention in the writing itself was different from the man who had stood by a fireplace in November and rehearsed the end of her marriage. She did not know what to do with this. She was honest with herself about that. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. Not yes, not no, not a resolution of anything. She wrote, I received your letter. I read it carefully. I believe it. Then I am not ready to know what that means. But I wanted you to know that it reached me. The real me. The one you're only beginning to see. She sealed it. She sat for another moment in the quiet of the Caldwell House evening. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not fall asleep thinking about what had been lost. She fell asleep thinking about what she had built, and what perhaps was still being built. Anne's response arrived on a Tuesday. Richard read it standing at the estate desk, still in his riding clothes from the morning field check, and he read it so many times that Mrs. Chambers, passing the open library door, saw him standing motionless with a half-page letter, and quietly redirected 2 servants away from that corridor. I received your letter. I read it carefully. I believe it. I knew Anne well enough now, better than he had in 10 years of marriage, which was its own particular kind of pain, to understand what those 3 sentences contained. She was not closing a door. She was also not opening one. She was doing the thing she had always done, which was refusing to be dishonest about where she actually stood, in favor of telling him what would be more comfortable to hear. He believed it. He put the letter in the drawer with the others. Then he went back to work, because that was what a man did when he was trying to become, rather than waiting to be rewarded for the attempt. September came in hard that year, with a cold snap in the first week that nobody anticipated, and that cost 2 counties significant early harvest. At Winthrop Hall, Richard had been watching the weather closely enough, had been in the fields consistently enough that the estate's losses were contained. Not eliminated. Farming was never entirely within any man's control, but contained, managed, the damage distributed in a way that didn't devastate any single family. He sent extra stores to the Hartley cottage without being asked. Tom Hartley came to the estate office the following morning. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, Mrs. Winthrop used to do that. Send before we knew to ask. Richard looked at him. I know. Takes a certain kind of paying attention. Tom Hartley turned his hat slowly. Most people wait to be told. She never waited. No, sir. A pause. She never did. The old farmer nodded once with the gravity of a man who has said what he came to say and left. Richard stood in the empty office for a moment. Then Patrick Connolly knocked on the open door. The boy had been coming every Tuesday and Thursday morning now, working through the accounts with a focus that, still 2 months in, managed to surprise Richard with its precision. The September figures, sir. Patrick set the ledger on the desk with the careful pride he brought to everything. I've also identified a pattern in the quarterly supply costs that I think you should see. There's been a consistent overcharge from the Bellamy grain supplier going back to 1814. Richard looked at the figures. How much? Approximately $230 over 4 years. Richard stared at him. 4 years. Yes, sir. Patrick kept his voice even, but could not entirely suppress the satisfaction of someone whose mind has done something genuinely useful. Mrs. Winthrop's records were meticulous. The pattern is clear once you look across years rather than seasons. Richard looked at the boy, 14 years old. Formerly the son of a family, making impossible choices between medicine and food. Now sitting at an estate desk, identifying 4-year fraud patterns with the calm confidence of someone who has discovered that the world responds to his intelligence. Well done, Patrick. The boy straightened slightly. Thank you, sir. After he left, Richard sat alone with the ledger and thought about a woman who had written, "Give him work. People of dignity can accept wages." He thought about how she had seen this possibility in a boy. She had met briefly during a tenant review, had seen it, and filed it away, and acted on it before anyone else had thought to look. He wrote to her that evening. He told her about Patrick and the Bellamy grain supplier, and $230 across 4 years. He told her that the boy had found it because Anne had kept meticulous records that made the pattern visible, which meant that even from Caldwell House, 4 months after leaving, she was still protecting his estate from errors she hadn't known to anticipate. He wrote, "Your care outlasted your presence. I am not sure I have ever encountered anything more characteristic of you." He sent it without burning it first. Anne read that letter at the kitchen table at Caldwell House, early on a Saturday morning before Briggs arrived, and before the household was fully awake with a cup of tea going cold beside her because she had forgotten it was there. She read it twice. Then she sat with the specific feeling of being known accurately, not flatteringly, not with the soft distortions of someone who wants something from you, but precisely the way a careful observer describes what they have actually seen. It was, she realized, the first time Richard had ever described her precisely. Not because he lacked the intelligence to do so. He had never lacked intelligence. But precision required attention, and attention required deciding that the subject was worth it, and he had never until apparently now made that particular decision about her. She thought about what it meant that he was making it now. She thought about James Caldwell, who was coming for supper that evening. She thought about the word deserve, about who deserved what, about whether deserve was even the right frame for the choices that remained in front of her. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "Patrick Connolly will be remarkable. I am glad you gave him the chance to show it. That is the right thing, Richard. Not the strategic thing. The right thing. There is a difference, and the fact that you know the difference now matters more than you perhaps understand." She put down the pen, picked it up again, added, "I have been thinking about your letter. The one before this. I am still thinking about it." She sealed it and set it aside for posting. Then she finished her tea and went to review the autumn accounts because the estate required her attention, and she had learned, was still learning, would perhaps always be learning, that her own requirements were worth attending to before anyone else's. James Caldwell arrived at 6. He brought wine from his family's Maryland property and a book he had found in Philadelphia that he thought she would like, a collection of essays on land management by an English agricultural reformer, whose ideas were, he said, approximately 30 years ahead of common practice, but whose writing was clear enough to be useful now. Anne looked at the book. "How did you know I'd find this interesting? You mentioned in August that you thought the drainage problem on your north field was symptomatic of a broader soil management issue that wasn't being addressed by standard methods." James set the wine on the sideboard. "I remembered." Anne looked at him. He remembered. Not because he was performing attentiveness, because he had been listening with the genuine interest of someone for whom her actual thoughts had actual value. "Thank you," she said. They had supper in the small dining room, just the two of them, comfortable in the easy way of people who have been in enough rooms together to have stopped requiring entertainment from each other and can simply be. James asked about the autumn harvest losses from the September cold snap. Anne asked about a legal matter in his own family's estate that he had mentioned in his last letter. They talked about Patrick Connolly, whose story Anne had told him in August, and who James now inquired after with the specificity of someone who had retained the details. $230, James repeated when she told him about the grain supplier. 4 years. 4 years. And the boy found it. He found it because Richard kept the records I established. Anne picked up her wine. Which means that something I built is still working. James looked at her carefully. How do you feel about that? The question was direct and genuine, the way his questions always were. Anne considered it honestly. Complicated, she said finally. It is good. It is genuinely good. I am glad the records are being used. Glad they served a purpose beyond the years I was there to maintain them. But it is also, she paused. It is strange being useful to a life you are no longer living. He's writing to you. Not a question. James knew. She had told him weeks ago with the honesty she had committed to bringing to whatever this was between them. Yes. And Anne set down her glass. The letters have been. I did not expect them to be what they are. She looked at James directly because he deserved that. I expected apology letters. Letters that were about managing his own guilt. Instead, they are specific. He writes about specific people, specific decisions, what they cost, and what they returned. He is paying attention in a way he never paid attention when I was present. James was quiet. That is a hard thing, he said. Yes. And what do you do with it? Anne looked at her hands. I don't know yet, she said. I am being honest with you. I know. He looked at her steadily. I want you to be. A pause. James? Yes. I am not the woman I was at Winthrop Hall. She held his gaze. I am not waiting for someone to see me. I am not arranging myself around another person's comfort. I have built something here that I intend to keep regardless of what happens elsewhere. I know that. And I find your company valuable. More than valuable. I find that I think more clearly when you are here, and I find that I want you to be here. And those are not small things for me. They are not things I say or feel easily. James held very still. They are not small things for me either, he said quietly. But I am also honest enough to tell you that I am in the middle of something I haven't finished yet. She looked at him with the clear, direct attention that was entirely and irreducibly herself. I don't know what Richard's letters mean for me. I don't know if they mean anything beyond a man finally learning what he should have learned years ago. I am not keeping you waiting. I am simply being truthful about where I am. James was quiet for a long moment. Then, Anne, his voice was steady. I am not asking you to resolve anything on my behalf. I am asking nothing of you except what you are able to give honestly. Whatever that is, and whenever you know what it is, that is what I am here for. She looked at him. You are a remarkably patient man. I am a man who has found someone worth patience. He picked up his wine. The two things are related. Anne felt something in her chest that was not complicated at all. She noted it, filed it away in the place where she kept things that mattered. October arrived, and with it the fullness of autumn at both estates, the harvest completion, the winter preparations, the particular busy purposefulness of properties that were being genuinely managed by people who understood what they were doing. At Winthrop Hall the season went better than any harvest in 4 years. Richard knew this was partly weather and partly luck, and mostly the cumulative effect of decisions Anne had made, and systems she had built that were finally being maintained with the attention they required. He wrote to her at the end of the harvest month with the specific numbers yields by field tenant supply levels. The Connolly medicine arrangement, which was now sustainable and properly structured the Hartley cottage, which was for the first time in 5 years going into winter with fully repaired drainage and a well-stocked larder. He wrote, I have been thinking about what you said when you left, that you always wondered what would make me stop choosing you. I have been sitting with that question all year, and I think the honest answer is nothing. Nothing made me stop choosing you. I simply failed to understand that choosing someone is not a single decision made once. It is a daily practice, a daily orientation, and I let mine drift without noticing until it had drifted very far. He paused. Continued, I cannot recover the years. I know that. But I find myself wanting to tell you that if I had understood this at 30, at 35, at any point before the specific November evening, when I understood it too late, I would not have drifted. I am certain of this now. Not because I am trying to rewrite history. Because I understand now what was there, and I would not have been indifferent to it if I had seen it. He sealed the letter. He held it in his hands for a moment. Then he added one more line on the outside, below the seal, in his small, precise hand. "I am not asking for anything. I simply wanted you to know." Anne received that letter on a Friday morning. She read it at the estate desk as she read all his letters now in the early hours before the day's work fully claimed her. She read the line added outside the seal 3 times. Then she made a decision. Not impulsively, not emotionally. With the careful, clear-eyed deliberateness that was her nature at its most fundamental, the same quality that had allowed her to read 10 years of estate accounts with accuracy, to see the Connolly boy's dignity as a factor equal to his need to understand that the Miller family's lease was unjust without anyone having to tell her. She saw this situation clearly. She knew what she felt about James Caldwell. It was real, and it was growing, and it was the particular good fortune of a woman who has learned what she deserves and has found someone who delivers it without being asked. She also knew, and this was the part she had been honest with herself about, alone in the early mornings when there was no audience for either self-deception or performance, that what she felt when she read Richard's letters was not nothing. It was not the old feeling. It was not the feeling of a woman hoping to be chosen. It was something different and harder to name. The feeling of a person seeing themselves finally described accurately by someone who previously couldn't manage it. The particular resonance of being known by someone who didn't know you before, but is learning you now with genuine effort. She did not know what to do with 2 real things existing simultaneously. She wrote to Eleanor, not to ask for advice. Eleanor's opinions on the situation were clear and had been clearly communicated. She wrote because Eleanor was the person who knew both of her parents, with the clear eyes of a child who grew up watching, and a woman who had grown up thinking, and because sometimes what you need is not advice, but witness. She wrote, "I am trying to figure out the difference between what I owe myself and what I owe the truth of what is happening. I thought these were the same thing. I am no longer certain." Eleanor's response arrived 6 days later. It was brief. It said, "Mother, you spent 10 years making yourself smaller so someone else could feel larger. You are not required to make yourself smaller now in any direction. Not for the past and not for the present. The question is not what you owe anyone. The question is what you want. What does Anne Montgomery want? Not Anne Winthrop. Not the woman who managed Winthrop Hall. Not the woman who is managing Caldwell House. Anne. What does she want?" Anne read this, sitting on the edge of her bed on a Sunday morning, with the Caldwell House autumn sounds coming through the walls, and she sat with the question, the way she sat with difficult account problems, without rushing, without forcing, letting the numbers show her what they actually said. She sat with it for a long time. Richard came to Caldwell House in November. Exactly 1 year after the November evening when he had stood by a library fireplace and said words that ended 10 years of marriage. He had not planned the timing. He was aware of it only when he was already writing, when the calendar presented the fact to him, and he understood it as appropriate the full circle of a year in which everything had changed. He had not announced this visit either, but this time when Mrs. Pratt opened the door and asked him to wait, he waited differently. Not with the calculated patience of a man who has planned what he will say. With the simple patience of a man who has decided that whatever comes of this afternoon will be true, and that truth is the only frame he wants to work inside. Anne came to the hall in 14 minutes. She was in her working clothes, the practical dark dress she wore for estate mornings, her hair simply arranged. She had not changed when she heard who was at the door. He understood this was deliberate. She was receiving him as she actually was, not as she had arranged herself to be. He respected it enormously. "Richard?" "Anne." He stood. "I know I should have written. You should have." A pause, and something in her expression that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "I find I've stopped being surprised." They went to the small parlor again. The same room. 1 year's difference sitting in the air between them. Anne did not wait for him to begin. "I've been thinking about your letters," she said. "All of them, the whole year of them." "I know. They changed." She looked at him directly. "From the first one to the most recent. They changed in a specific way." At the beginning, I could feel the effort in them, the consciousness of trying to demonstrate something. By autumn, the effort was gone. They were simply what you were actually thinking. I could tell the difference. Richard was very still. What does that mean to you? It means, Anne said carefully, that something real happened, not a performance of change, actual change. She paused. I have seen people perform change. It looks different. It collapses under examination. Yours didn't collapse. Every detail you cited was specific and verifiable. And when I checked them, because I did check Richard, because I am who I am, they held. You checked. The Connolly arrangement, the Hartley drainage outcome, Patrick's bookkeeping work. I have sources in that county. A brief, unambiguous look. I always did. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Of course you did. Yes. She held his gaze. I needed to know whether I was reading the truth or a very well-crafted presentation of it. And the truth. A breath. Which makes this considerably more complicated. Richard looked at her. There is someone, he said. Not a question. He had known it from Thomas's letter, had known it from the quality of silence in her own. Yes. A good man. A very good man. Anne did not look away. A man who sees me clearly, who asks real questions, who remembers what I say and uses it to understand me better rather than to construct a more effective approach. Does he make you happy? Anne considered this honestly. He makes me feel seen, she said, consistently, without being asked to. That's better than happy. Yes, quietly. It is. Richard sat with that. I'm not here to compete with him, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am not here to press any claim or make any argument about prior right or history or any of the things a lesser version of me might try to invoke. He looked at her. I am here because the year ends today, and I wanted to look you in the face and tell you something I should have told you 10 years ago. Anne was very still. You were never ordinary, Richard said. Not for a single day. I made you feel ordinary. I looked at something extraordinary and treated it as furniture, as background as given. That was my failure, not a failure of love, but of vision. And vision can be corrected but not retroactively, and I understand that. Anne's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I see you now, he continued. I know it is late. I know it is possibly too late. But I wanted you to know that the person I failed to see was not hidden. She was present, entirely present every day we shared. She was the one building things, and maintaining things, and knowing things, and caring for people. She was the most capable person in every room she entered, and she was quiet about it, and I mistook the quiet for absence. He stopped. The room was very quiet. Why are you telling me this? Anne's voice was even but not untouched. Here, now. Because you deserve to hear it from my face, not from paper. He held her gaze. And because whatever you decide about your life, about James Caldwell, about what happens next, I wanted you to make that decision, having heard the truth from me directly. Not as leverage, not to influence the outcome. As a debt I owed you that is long past due. Anne looked at him for a long moment. Something passed through her face. Not one thing, but several in quick succession. The way a woman's face moves when she is not performing, but simply feeling. Then she said, I forgive you. The words arrived without ceremony. Richard absorbed them. Anne, not because what happened is acceptable, she continued. Not because the years are recoverable. Not as an invitation or a door or a promise of anything. I forgive you because I have been carrying the weight of not forgiving you, and I find that I am done carrying it. A breath. I am a woman who is building something real. I do not have the energy for old grievances, and I do not want to spend the rest of my life being the woman who was hurt. I would rather spend it being the woman who chose something better. Something better, Richard repeated quietly. Something better. She met his eyes without flinching. For everyone involved, including you. He understood what she was saying. He sat with it. I will not ask for more than this, he said finally. I know. A pause. But I want you to know something, Richard. What you have become this year, it matters. Not to me in the way you might have hoped, but it matters in the world. The Patrick Connollys of that estate will know a different version of their landowner than they would have known a year ago. The Hartley family will have better seasons because you finally walked the East Field. Those things are real, and they are good, and they happened because you changed. They happened because you showed me how. No. She shook her head gently but clearly. I showed you for 10 years and you didn't see. You changed because you chose to see. That is not my credit. That is yours. Richard sat with that distinction. It was harder to receive than blame. What happens now? He asked. Anne looked at her hands, then at him. You go home, she said simply. You continue becoming the man you are becoming. You take care of your estate and your tenants and your children, and you let your children be proud of you, which I think Thomas and Eleanor are beginning to be. A pause. And I continue building what I am building. And James Caldwell. And James Caldwell. Clear, honest, not cruel. Richard nodded once, the nod of a man who has received something real and knows better than to argue with it. He stood. He picked up his hat. Anne. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for the forgiveness. I know it cost you something. Everything worth giving does. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back one last time. The painting, he said. The Virginia Hills. I never asked you why you chose it. Anne looked at him, a long moment. I chose it, she said, because I thought you should have something in your own home that reminded you of beauty. Something that required nothing from you. That simply was. He held that. I looked at it every day for 10 years, he said quietly. I know. I never saw what it was. No. Her voice was not unkind. But you see it now. He put on his hat. I walked out of Caldwell House into the November afternoon 1 year to the month since everything had broken, and he was not a fixed man, not a redeemed man in the clean narrative sense, not a man who had gotten back what he had thrown away. He was simply a man who had learned at great cost that the most valuable things in a life are rarely the things that announce themselves. They are the things that hold everything else up, the things that are so consistently present you forget to ask how or why or at what cost to themselves. He rode home through the November afternoon. The Winthrop Hall Drive came into view as the light was failing. He rode up it slowly, looking at the house, the stone walls, the winter gardens, the kitchen light burning in the window. He thought of all the evenings Anne had kept that light burning. He thought of Mrs. Chambers pressing her lips together the morning of the departure. He thought of Tom Hartley saying she never waited to be asked. He thought of Patrick Connolly sitting at the estate desk with the careful pride of a boy discovering his own value. I thought of a woman who crouched in the spring dirt to look at a bird's nest because a child had found it and because paying attention was simply what she did. He dismounted. James Whitmore took his horse without a word. Richard walked into Winthrop Hall. Mrs. Chambers was in the entrance hall reviewing something with the footman, and she looked up when he entered with the professional attention she always brought to his movements. Sir, Mrs. Chambers. He handed her his coat. Is Patrick Connolly still here? He stayed late, sir. The quarterly reconciliation. Richard nodded. Tell him I'll review the figures with him in the morning. A pause. And tell him the work he's doing matters. Tell him I said so directly. Mrs. Chambers looked at him. A different look than she had given him in 20 years. Yes, sir, she said. I'll tell him. Richard went to the library. He sat in his chair. He looked at the painting. Virginia Hills green and permanent, chosen by a young woman who believed he deserved something beautiful in his own home. He looked at it for a long time, and for the first time in 10 years he actually saw it. He saw the particular quality of light in the upper left corner. The way the hills folded into each other in the distance. The small detail in the lower right that he had never noticed a single figure tiny against the landscape standing at the edge of a field, looking out. He had never seen the figure before. He saw it now. He sat alone in the library of Winthrop Hall and understood the final lesson that Winthrop Hall had taken a year to teach him. the lesson that Anne Montgomery had never spoken aloud, because she had spent a lifetime understanding that some truths can only be received, never delivered. A person may survive being hurt. They may even forgive it. But they will not remain invisible for anyone. Not once they have discovered what it feels like to be seen. And the greatest loss a man can suffer is not losing someone's love. It is understanding too late that he had it fully, quietly, extraordinarily, and looked at it every single day without ever once knowing what he was looking at. Richard Winthrop looked at the painting until the fire burned low. Then he built it back up himself and sat with what remained. End of part 5.